afternoon and welcome to the JLX Friends and Benefits podcast. With me, your host as always, Xander Conobit. And today I have a very special guest in Ollie Odell. Ollie is fourth year PhD student at Birmingham University. Ollie and I and Jack actually all went to Exeter University together. And it's fantastic to have Ollie on today because he's a serious amount of brains. And we had a bit of a issue with the last podcast. So I've got a good insight into just how extensive they are. And I'm really excited to introduce him and then let him kind of talk us through those points and really get you guys some fantastic and high quality information. So before we do that, Ollie, if you just would like to kind of introduce yourself, let us know a bit more about your research, what you've been up to, and then we'll dive in from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Xander. As you said, my name is Ollie. I am currently in the final year of my PhD at the University of Birmingham in the Department of Sport, Exercise and Rehabilitation Sciences. My PhD is in sports nutrition and exercise metabolism. My research basically has two aspects. So the first is carbohydrate metabolism for exercise and sport. So that covers things like carbohydrate as fuel, carbohydrate loading, intake during exercise, and also carbohydrate requirements after exercise, recovery, that kind of thing. The other aspect is dairy, and specifically dairy carbohydrates, and also to some extent dairy protein. And the intersection of these two aspects is basically the carbohydrate lactose, and trying to assess whether lactose might have a role to play in sports nutrition. Because it's not a popular carbohydrate. It doesn't feature in guidelines for carbohydrate intake, despite the fact that lots of athletes and recreationally active people are probably consuming quite large amounts of lactose through things like milk, yogurts, and whey protein.
Fantastic. So looking in then at that kind of topic and things like that, you've obviously done some studies yourself. You've looked into that in great detail, and we're going to kind of dive into that a bit more as we go. Are there any areas specifically, just as like an opening question, maybe that really take you as kind of quite fascinating, or maybe areas you specifically amongst all those things that you enjoy the most?
That's a good question. One thing that I'm really interested in, and hopefully we'll be tackling next year in my PhD, is lactose for recovery. I'm interested whether lactose is a viable carbohydrate that can be used in a post-exercise recovery scenario for things like replenishing glycogen and restoring performance recovery. So that's one thing that stands out, and I hope to be able to answer that thoroughly at some point in the next year. But yeah, that's one of the things that's in my head as a hot topic in sports nutrition and in my area specifically.
Fantastic. And we're going to kind of dive into lactose a little bit later on. But as you said, so a lot of your research is based around kind of dairy, lactose. And before I think we kind of dive into those things, because that's certainly what we want to pick your brains about. And I'm sure that a lot of people listening in will have either thought about maybe dropping dairy, going kind of down that plant-based route, or even maybe are kind of in that intermediate phase where they're not even sure if it's good for them or not. So before we kind of dive into that, what kind of reasons have you experienced or know of, the kind of the most popular ones, as to why people are kind of going away from dairy as a product in their diet? And maybe just give us a little bit of background on why that is.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always speaking to people who are thinking about changing their diet. When it comes to things like dairy is a really big part of that. I'd say the most common reason that I come across is veganism or going plant-based. And that's usually obviously from either an ethical reason or an environmental reason. Veganism and plant-based diets have really taken off. Obviously, they've been around for a while, but they've really taken off in the past few years. They've become incredibly popular, and dairy is often seen as one of those things that people should be cutting out as part of a vegan diet. On top of, vegetarians often start to wean themselves off dairy, but obviously vegans focus on it a lot more because it's one of those almost hidden animal products that people don't think of, whereas meat is very, very easy to think about as being an animal product.
Definitely.
People also have perceptions of dairy as being quite unhealthy. And there have actually been quite a few studies into people's perceptions of dairy. And if you ask children what they think of as being healthy foods, lots of them answer, glass of milk, dairy foods. But actually, once you get to adults, you can do those same studies in adults, and adults don't report milk and dairy products as being healthy foods. They tend to see them as heart disease causing, diabetes inducing, really unhealthy foods. So people do tend to cut out dairy on the whole for what they perceive to be health benefits. Another one would be the fact that there are a lot more alternatives now to dairy products, basically. So years ago, really, if you wanted something in your coffee, your option was milk or water. Now, if you like the taste of something like oat milk or almond milk, you've got that option. There's no reason not to try it if you like it, or to change milk for it if that's what you prefer the taste of. And increasingly, there are quite tasty, high quality, good nutrition, non dairy cheeses and yogurts that people are starting to move towards, because they can offer many of the same taste and texture positives that dairy foods offer. So that's one big thing. Then perhaps one of the biggest is lactose intolerance. That's another reason why people really move away from dairy, and it's quite common in lots of people. And we'll go on to talk about more about it, but it's a really valid reason for many people removing dairy foods and lactose from their diet. But it's something that lots of people who don't necessarily need to remove it will think about. They'll think about whether perhaps they are lactose intolerant, whether they're lactose sensitive. Maybe they'll consider whether it's something they need to remove from their diet.
Just before we dive into lactose, because that's certainly something we're going to get into, you mentioned an interesting point, and that was on the shift between childhood views of dairy products and healthy foods. Like, we talk about milk being one of those things. It's good for your teeth, it's good for your bones, good for your nails, and that's something our parents teach us, right? But then we grow older and we have all these conflicting views on the health aspect of things. Not that this is going to be the main kind of driver of this conversation, but it seems you mentioned it, I think it would be worth diving into slightly. And that is there really any evidence to suggest that dairy diet, like a diet that is consistent in dairy and not to any kind of high level, but I mean an average level, is bad for you? Or is that more just a conspiracy that's kind of built potentially on people's lack of ability to digest lactose?
So there's been a lot of research into dairy as a whole and whether dairy is a healthy food group. Obviously, that's a very difficult question to answer, and it plays on the fact that people do tend to think of certain foods as being healthy or unhealthy. There have been lots of studies into whether dairy is associated with more of certain diseases. So there have been lots of at population level epidemiological studies that try to associate dairy with either better or worse health outcomes. And on the whole, they've shown that there have been these huge studies, systematic reviews of lots of studies, and they tend to show that dairy is not actually associated with poorer health outcomes. It's not associated with type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, stroke, and in some cases, high dairy intake can actually be somewhat protective, or at least tends to be less associated with these serious health conditions than lower dairy intake. Obviously, lactose intolerance, I tend to think of that as being a sort of a separate issue to the general issue of dairy and health, because it's one of those things that people tend to know if they have it. It's a specific condition rather than a food group's effect on general health.
Yeah. Well, thank you for clarifying. And that was something which I felt was probably a good place to start, because we see so much in social media at the moment, and I'm sure you'll agree that there is a huge demonization on dairy. And I think that from an environmental point, which we'll cover, I'm sure, that there is a certain amount of backing behind that. But I think it's important that when you are looking at specific aspects of your diet and removing or keeping those aspects of your diet, you look in the truthful reason of that. So if you're going to remove dairy because of health reasons, and this is something which I've heard a lot of as well, and I question those people and I say, I don't mind either way what you do, but why is that? Where did you get that from? And I think it's important that if you're considering it, the reasons. If it's environmental, have at it. If it's even that you think in your heart of hearts that it might be better for you, rather than not being good for you, then have at it as well. But do make sure that you do your due diligence, and make sure that it's not just kind of a social media driven kind of view that you have, because it's important that you actually do what's best for your health in the long term. And a lot of people aren't necessarily out to improve your health when they are kind of saying what they're doing, as much as kind of what you should be doing.
One really popular sort of soundbite that I hear a lot about dairy is that dairy is inflammatory and that dairy causes inflammation. And you've probably heard it. It's a very common claim. You can claim that any food is inflammatory. It's not that difficult to actually assess. And there have been studies into whether dairy does promote inflammation. And they've actually shown that it doesn't. It's one of those common myths that keeps going around. So dairy, it's not inflammatory. And that's a really big key point that I see posted a lot on social media as a potential mechanism for why dairy is bad for you in the long run.
Could you just define that for us? So there'll be some people who are like, "Oh, inflammation is terrible," but firstly, is it terrible? And secondly, maybe when people say, dairy is inflammatory, or what does that mean? What are the outcomes of that?
Yeah, so inflammation is associated with the presence of a number of chemicals and molecules in your body. In some cases, they can have negative effects. In others, they can have positive. So lots of diseases are associated with low-level, prolonged inflammation in the body. These are things like heart disease is actually associated with it, as well as things like aging. In fact, some people have described aging as inflammaging, because some of the negative aspect of aging are so strongly associated with inflammation. And what you can do to test if whether something is acutely inflammatory is to simply feed a person that food or expose that person to something and look at whether they have an inflammatory response, whether they produce these chemicals and molecules into their blood. That's been done with dairy. There doesn't seem to be a response. It's very easy to say, oh, this causes inflammation and therefore it's bad. But actually, we know that a number of things are inflammatory and are actually quite good. So exercise being the key thing. If you do a big bout of resistance training, if you do squats or some heavy resistance training, you're going to get a serious amount of inflammation. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. Exercise is very clearly good for you. So inflammation is widely misunderstood and used, I think, quite often as a buzzword in nutrition and health.
Definitely. Jack and I have spoken about this before, possibly even on a podcast, where people have used the word chemicals as a way out. Oh, that has chemicals in it. Or if you can't pronounce the word, then but I challenge you to pronounce the chemicals that make up blueberries. You're going to have a hard time. And I'm pretty sure blueberries aren't bad for you. So it's important, as I said earlier, that and you've hit the nail on the head there, we don't take these kind of buzzwords or these sections or these kind of sound bites of information and go, that must be what I should do now. And even when you get kind of signposted to these problems, you kind of have these issues that you really want to fix quickly. It's important that to get a proper fix, you take your time to understand why these things are happening. And I think that takes us perfectly then into probably one of the bigger issues in the fitness industry is the demonization of lactose. And you've got some fantastic points on this, I know, and I'm going to kind of let you go on this. But just to kick us off, what kind of is lactose intolerance, and what are the potential side effects that someone who is lactose intolerant may have?
Yeah, that's a great question. Lactose intolerance it's a really quite a common condition. You probably know people with it, and people who say they have it, and many people who really definitely do have it and they know about it. It's something that people self-diagnose very often, and this often happens without any clinical diagnosis, which can be quite an important thing, even for something that people think of as being quite mild. because it's not a disease. People don't think they need to go to the doctor to diagnose lactose intolerance, but it can be something that is worthwhile speaking to a doctor if you think you have it. But to understand what lactose intolerance really is, I'll just explain what lactose is as a starter and how it's metabolized and what goes wrong with it, basically. So, lactose is a dairy sugar. It's the dairy sugar. Effectively, it's basically only found in milk, and it's found in most mammals' milks. But obviously, we tend to predominantly eat and drink cow's milk. It is a disaccharide, which means it's a sugar that's made of two other sugars. And lactose is basically a sugar that's made of one molecule of glucose bound to one molecule of galactose. And glucose, most people are familiar with. It's the basic carbohydrate. It makes up things like starches. It's where we get the vast majority of the carbohydrate that we eat. Galactose, on the other hand, is a bit different. We get the vast majority of the galactose that we eat through eating the lactose molecule, and that comes from dairy. There are small amounts of galactose in things like garbanzo beans and a few other very specific food groups, but it's very unlikely that people are eating these foods in sufficient quantities for them to be nutritionally relevant. So lactose is the primary source of galactose in the diet. And lactose, as I said, it's a sugar made of two individual sugars bound together. And when we eat it, it goes into our stomach and into our intestines, and it needs to be broken down because we can't absorb that lactose directly into the bloodstream. What needs to happen is it needs to be broken down into two constituent sugars, and then they can be absorbed individually and separately. Now, if they are digested properly, you basically just absorb those as you would any other sugar or any other carbohydrate, and they're absorbed and they can be used for anything that other carbohydrates would be. So they can be used to fuel your brain, fuel your muscle. They can go and form glycogen in the muscle or the liver, and that's sort of the normal digestion and metabolism of lactose. Now, lactose intolerance is sort of when things go wrong. It's the other side of the coin. And that is caused by what we describe as lactose maldigestion. And that is a separate condition that leads to lactose intolerance. So lactose maldigestion is where where an individual is unable to digest that lactose molecule. Usually because they don't have enough of the enzyme lactase, which is the enzyme that breaks down the lactose molecule. And that's usually genetically determined whether someone has high or low levels of the lactase enzyme. It's quite interesting. It's geographically determined, basically. So if you are from certain parts of the world, you're much less likely to have that lactase enzyme, have higher or low levels. So, for example, if you live in India, if you're from South Asia, about 90% of the people there have low levels of the enzyme lactase. And if you compare that to places like Europe, the UK, Northern Europe, especially Scandinavia, it's the other way around. 95% of people have high levels of the enzyme, and are therefore likely to not be lactose intolerant. So what happens when people don't have high levels or high enough levels of the enzyme is that the lactose goes through the stomach and reaches the intestine, and it's not digested. And it passes through the intestines, and that's a problem because after the intestines comes your colon. And your colon, there shouldn't really be anything in there other than fiber and a bit of water and all the undigested food. There shouldn't be sugar in there, basically. And what happens when lactose enters the colon is it can draw in water because you've now got a sugary solution, basically. It draws in water, and that can cause the most common, most well-known side effect of lactose intolerance, which is diarrhea. Probably the most unpleasant of the symptoms, and that can obviously cause things like cramping and pain because there's water being drawn in, and it can cause distortion and things. So it's not a very pleasant experience either. Now there are other symptoms as well. So what happens to some of the lactose is that it can be fermented by gut bacteria. So you're probably well aware that we have a whole host of bacteria in our guts, and most of those are in the colon. And many of those are able to metabolize and ferment some of this lactose. And the problem with that is that some of these bacteria produce gases. They produce things like hydrogen and methane, and you basically have an inflating balloon inside you when that happens. And obviously, that doesn't sound very nice, and it's not very nice. And that can lead to things like flatulence, bloating, gassiness, and also contribute to pain and cramping, things like that. So that is effectively lactose intolerance. It's defined as the symptoms that a person gets when they eat lactose. And those are predominantly gastrointestinal symptoms, but some people also report things like fatigue and general nausea. They're predominantly gastrointestinal, and they are caused by lactose maldigestion, so the insufficient digestion of lactose.
That's a really good example and well spoke through. So just on that, now I'm going to give you an example here and I'm going to use myself. So I was very lactose intolerant as a child, had all the symptoms you discussed here, but always kept a little bit going. Like I was never completely off it. It wasn't something I could never digest. I could only kind of manage a certain amount. And as I went through adulthood and like now, something I noticed less and less until I started really getting into fitness and I started really kind of increasing the amount of food I ate, and then protein came in, milk came in more. As you said, in athletes, very, very readily available source of protein, which is fantastic. But I kept finding that on a Sunday of all days, I just felt awful. I'd have really poor digestion. I'd be very bloated, very gassy, and I'd feel really tired. And at the time when this started to really get me was a time when I was working very hard, long hours, and I just assumed that because it was my day off, my body was just like, hey, I'm going to use this to recover now. And it wasn't actually until one day I drove to the airport. And on this day I drove to the airport was a Sunday. And I suddenly thought, I feel brilliant. I feel absolutely great. And then I thought to myself, it can't be that it's just the fact that I'm going on holiday, because that didn't, no good news didn't stop me feeling bad before. And I kind of sat there in the car and I kind of worked my way back through what I'd done differently. And what I'd actually done is I'd not had my protein shake. I had only had my bowl of cereal. So on a Sunday, I'd have a bowl of cereal and my protein shake pretty much together. Whereas during the week and on a Saturday when I would be working, I would always have a maybe overnight oats that I could take to the gym with me, and I'd have my protein shake, but they would never be side by side because I'd try and stretch them out through the day. And then I realized that actually what I had was this almost mega dose of milk and lactose in this one sitting. And so to bring this full circle into a question, my question to you would be, I don't necessarily class myself as lactose intolerant because I can still digest some. But is it possible to then have almost a threshold, which I think I have, where effectively I can digest up to a certain amount, but then beyond that point, I can, I'm in trouble basically. Um, is that a thing?
Yeah, really good question. Lots of people think of lactose intolerance as being like a simple on-off switch. And that's sort of an easy way to think of it. But actually, we know that there's much more of a range in the ability to handle and digest lactose. So you do sort of have these two major groups. You do have the people who are lactose intolerant to some degree, and then you have the people who are lactose tolerant. But you have a lot of individual variability within those groups. So people who are lactose intolerant may be able to handle almost no lactose. So talking like less than a gram or less than a couple of grams, they might get symptoms from there, all the way up to, and that would be sort of a serving of cheese might set them off, which has very low levels of lactose. Even something like a half a pizza or something, a few slices of pizza, that could set them off. But then people who would be generally considered lactose intolerant might actually be able to handle up to about 12 or 15 grams of lactose, which is about 250, 300 mils of milk, a good sized glass of milk. And that's sort of the range for people who are lactose intolerant. People who are lactose tolerant, there's a lot more range there. Some people who are lactose tolerant might be okay eating, drinking a pint of milk, about 25 grams of lactose, um, whereas others might be able to drink liters of milk.
Hmm.
So there is a range within lactose tolerance and lactose intolerance, and some people can handle more or less, depending on a number of factors, just on genetics and also based on how much lactose they eat, on a regular basis.
So based on what we know then, I mean, firstly, that's very interesting. And I think that kind of makes me feel better about the situation. But based on what we know of how enzymes can be upregulated and downregulated within the body, is then lactase an enzyme that can be upregulated and downregulated? Thereby, if I were to stop eating dairy whatsoever, would I then have an issue in reintroducing it? Like maybe if you take on another enzyme, for example, that maybe it gets downregulated, then you have a much bigger problem getting it back? Or is it something which is relatively flexible and potentially reversible?
Yeah, good, really good question. Because lots of enzymes in the body, wherever they are in the body, are very adaptable. So if you stop doing certain things, your body does realize that it no longer needs them. It downregulates those enzymes, switches them off while they're not being used. Interestingly, lactose is not actually one of those. So
Hmm.
your lactase expression, your ability to digest is generally set. It's generally quite level throughout your life. So it's quite high when you're a child, when you're born, and all you're eating is milk. But after that, once you get to childhood, adolescence sort of age, your lactase ability, your digesting ability remains pretty much constant for the rest of your life. But one really quite cool thing is that lactase, the enzyme, is not the only way of metabolizing lactose. So, like I said before, the enzyme, sorry, the bacteria in your gut are also capable of breaking down lactose and fermenting it. So, if you, as you said, were to cut out all dairy, all lactose, um, for a while, what would happen is that if you were to come back and try a dose of lactose that you're normally okay with, what could happen is that you actually experience worse symptoms than you previously did. That's not
Hmm.
because of the change in lactase. That's because the enzymes, the bacteria that are found in your gut have actually died off, because you're no longer feeding them lactose as a fuel source that they were using to survive and reproduce. So you've actually changed the bacterial composition in your gut. If you normally eat lactose, remove it and then come back to eating lactose. So you are right in that taking time off lactose, eating dairy, can reduce your ability to handle lactose. Not that you can, it's not because you're digesting less, but because the bacteria are less able to handle it. And the bacteria taking that lactose and using it can actually reduce the number of symptoms that you get. So you can definitely learn to manage more lactose, um, without symptoms by regularly eating lactose, which is quite a cool thing for people who are lactose intolerant.
Yeah, definitely. And also for people, I think, who maybe have gone more plant based or who have gone more on the lines of maybe veganism, but maybe want to include some kind of stronger forms of protein within their diet. It may not be the end of the road for you. You know, you might have, as Ollie said, a few days where your body's still like, well, hang on a minute, we aren't used to this right now. But as you said, it's reversible. We can get back into that. So if you have those couple of days and you're someone who's thinking about it, potentially you know now that those 2 days are almost going to be a given and that you are going to be expecting that now, so that should you come back around and go, actually, I'd like to introduce some more whey protein into my diet, that you have the capabilities to digest that. It just may take a few days.
Yeah,
Now,
it's one of those things. It can take variable amounts for different people, so it's something that probably happens on a scale of days to weeks rather than weeks to months. Um,
okay.
so it's not something that people need to take really slowly. It can be simply a matter of, if you're not fully plant based, but maybe you don't eat much dairy and you want to start reintroducing some, what you do is take half a scoop of whey and half a scoop of your normal non-dairy protein. Or maybe with your shake, you add 100 mils of milk, and then the day after you add a little bit more, and then you build up to a level that you want to sustain. And there's a benefit in that because, if you don't normally eat lactose and then suddenly you're exposed to a big lactose dose, maybe you have a milkshake at Five Guys, or you go to, you go and have a pizza and you don't normally eat pizza and there's a decent amount of cheese on there, you could suddenly have some really unpleasant side effects.
Definitely.
But by incorporating small amounts of lactose into your diet regularly, you can protect yourselves from those one-off excursions and having problems with those large amounts.
The big Saturdays at Five Guys. So we've discussed the things that I think set up perfectly the conversation in terms of what potentially some people already know. And there might be some people sat there going, I told you lactose was bad for you. But is it? Is it bad for you? Is it something which we need to be more cognizant of within our diets? Or is it something which potentially has a good effect? Maybe there's something that could be of benefit to us here.
Yeah.
What do you reckon?
Lactose, like I said, it's only found in dairy foods. It's something that doesn't really appear in any guidelines for carbohydrate intake. Most of the time when, you look at guidelines for carbohydrate intake and eating carbs before, during, after exercise, whatever, they're generally talking about things like glucose, which is, what most of our carbohydrate comes from, a starch. Lactose doesn't really feature in any guidelines. So as I mentioned before, one of the sort of potential uses or benefits to eating lactose is that it can feed the bacteria in your gut. So you've probably heard a whole lot in the past few years about the importance of a healthy gut microbiome, having a diverse flora. Yes. It's a hot topic at the moment.
Yeah.
People are taking things like prebiotics, things like fructooligosaccharides, FOS, or galactooligosaccharides, GOS. These are really common, things like inulin, because they foster good bacteria in the gut. And I don't like saying good bacteria. It's like saying good fat, bad fat. But we'll roll with it for now, because they foster good bacteria. And similarly, people will take probiotics, which contain the live bacteria in, because they want to foster those bacteria in their guts and promote those specific bacteria. Now, what we know about lactose is that in some people, very similar to prebiotics, it's able to feed those good bacteria, things like bifidobacteria, lactobacilli, which are, if you've heard of them, you've probably heard of them because of Yakult adverts.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you take a probiotic, then check out the label. And often when we talk about them, it's always they're the main guns you kind of want to get in there, and billions of the above, not just millions, as many millions as possible.
Yeah, probiotics are an interesting area. I've tried to sort of stay up to date and read on them. It's fascinating. I don't personally take them, but in terms of studies that have shown benefits, actually tend to show good benefits from things like yogurt-based dairy, things like Yakult. Fermented dairy are particularly good. Those seem to be good ways of taking it, and you know that they're alive. Whereas if you take a pill with probiotics in, you don't really know what's in there. You don't know whether those bacteria are freeze dried and have been dead since the day they were frozen. But at least if you're having something like yogurt or a yogurt drink, you know they're alive. But anyway, bit of a tangent. So
Number one.
Lactose is able to feed those good bacteria and can act a bit like a probiotic. So that's one potential benefit. It hasn't been as thoroughly directly investigated as it needs to be, but it's not like I'm suggesting you go and buy a new supplement that's unproven. It's something that's probably already in your diet. You're probably already incorporating it. So that's one nice possible benefit that you might be getting from lactose. Another sort of application for lactose, we actually published a study on this in May. We were looking at lactose as a fuel source, because lactose is a carbohydrate, and when we think of fuel, we're talking about carbohydrates generally. So this study we did, we involved endurance athletes, and we were interested in whether we can feed these endurance athletes lactose as a carbohydrate source during exercise to fuel this long-term endurance exercise. And what we did was we took these athletes, we got them to cycle for 2.5 hours on a bike, on a stationary bike, and we fed them either on a few different occasions. We fed them either lactose, isolated lactose, powder in water. We weren't giving them milk. Often when I tell people about the study, they think that we were force feeding them pints of Gold Top. Oh, I love milk, but I couldn't drink Gold Top on a bike.
No.
So yeah, we were feeding them basically lactose powder in water as a solution on one occasion. On another occasion, we gave them sucrose, so table sugar, just mixed in water. And on another third occasion, we just gave them plain water. And over this 2.5 hours, we took a number of measurements, took blood samples, breath samples. They had a mask on, so we were measuring a number of things through those. And what our primary finding was that actually lactose is burned for energy just as quickly and just as effectively as sucrose. There were no significant differences between lactose and sucrose in how quickly they were burned, which is something that many people might be a little bit surprised at. Because,
yeah, I am.
Yeah, and I think even when I was going to the study, it's quite easy to think of lactose as a sort of a slow burning carbohydrate, because one of the ways that we sort of measure how quickly carbohydrate takes effect is what's called the glycemic index. I'm sure many of your listeners are very familiar with it, but just briefly, it's a measure of 0 to 100, and it measures carbohydrates or whole foods based on how quickly they give a response in blood sugar. So something that gives a quick response in blood sugar has a high GI, and something that has a slow response has a low GI. So something like I don't know, honey will be higher than something like oats, and something like pure glucose powder, dextrose and maltodextrin, basically has a GI of 100, the highest possible, basically. So lactose, on the other hand, if you give lactose powder as a drink to someone, it comes quite low. It's about 46, which is a pretty low GI.
Yeah.
And generally, we think of the higher the GI, the more quickly it can be burned for energy. But actually, we were able to show that lactose and sucrose, which is a much faster, much higher GI and faster burning carbohydrate, were burned at pretty much identical rates during exercise. So we were able to show that lactose, far from being a problem, is actually a really viable carbohydrate source if you're looking to fuel exercise.
That's quite fun. That's quite interesting, actually. I was kind of playing along in my brain of how I thought this was going to plan out, and I full disclosure, I've not read this study, so I have no.
If you'd like to, it's open access, so you can get it online free.
I'll tell you what, we'll put it in the notes.
Yep, absolutely.
So I can put it in there, so anyone who wants to check it out, a bit of Ollie's work, would be fantastic. And if it's open access, which means you can all view it, so I'll stick that in the show notes down below, or in the comment section, just obviously in the YouTube bit. So with that, I was expecting it to be not kind of terrible, but also not even to match, especially for endurance exercise, and when we discuss endurance exercise, we're talking about, hours. We're not talking about 20-minute jog in the park. We're talking about a consistent level of exercise, which is continuous above an hour, right? It's not casual. And when Ollie said about wearing a mask, we're not talking about kind of COVID procedures, in case you were, confused. These are things that collect gases that then can be measured to see the rate of digestion of certain things, or kind of the usage by calculation of oxygen. It's very clever. It's very cool. But these are all very interesting measurements, because what we now have is that actually something we've previously demonized, and I think for many individuals where it's not even affected them. So take me, for example. I have my issues with lactose, but I still have it in my diet because it's something I appreciate and like. But it's not something which, as I said, if a doctor had said, don't consume it, it's not good for you, then, you're not going to continue poisoning yourself effectively. And obviously, if you're on public transport, the aftermath of what that can do is probably not going to be too pleasant for everyone around you, or in an office space.
It's like another sort of intolerance, take like celiac, where if you regularly eat gluten and you're celiac, you will effectively build up negative side effects over time. So if you cut it out, that's good. Whereas with lactose, it's not one of those things that necessarily you just cut out and that's that. It's one of those things that you can keep in. And the recommendations actually are currently for people who have lactose intolerance to still eat some small amounts on a regular basis, just not enough to trigger any side effects.
And you can do that, I guess, by something like I did. And it's interesting. I wasn't going to mention this because I didn't want to kind of say that this is what I did and then loads of people go and do it. So I don't recommend you do this, but I will say anyway. I did the complete opposite of what you did. When you mentioned about building up that tolerance again, I did the complete opposite. So what I did is I took my measurements of milk that I usually had. So I had 200 mils of milk in my cereal. I would have 400 mils of milk in my protein, and it wasn't isolate at the time. Then what I did is I said, right, well, I'm not going to change the isolate. I just had impact whey at the time, so more lactose in that. And I'm not going to change my cereal. But the one thing I know I can change very accurately and very easily is how much milk I put in my shake. So what I did is I gradually reduced the amount of milk I put in my shake. So I went from 400 down to 300, 300 to 200, 200 to 100, down to nothing. And I had a marked, really quite clear difference in how I felt energy-wise. Still was a bit glassy, still was a bit bloated. So I thought, right, what other easy thing can I change here? And I changed to an isolate then. And that was it. That literally was it. And I probably, if I had a need to, which I don't, I could probably add in some more milk at this point if I really wanted to. I have milk in my cereal, so meh. But I have no need to. I have it with water, my shake. But I probably could take that now. Now I've made the other changes, so that could potentially be a way of you trying to judge how much tolerance you have. I'm not sure if you have any better ideas or any other kind of more medical based procedures that you can do that for, but that's certainly how I did it.
Yeah, it's something that you really can experiment with if it's something you're interested in. If you do get digestive problems with lactose or dairy, provided you don't have an explicit dairy allergy, which generally speaking you would know about if you did have it, but there are some people who have a very mild allergy that actually doesn't get diagnosed until a bit later in life. But it is something you can definitely play around with and experiment with. From what it sounds like, this is just some rough maths, but you're saying 600 mils of milk in total, plus probably a couple of scoops of whey. That's about 35 grams of lactose. So there's 5 grams for every 100 mils of milk in milk, basically. So that's definitely that's in the lactose tolerant camp, I would say. That would give pretty severe side effects to people in the lactose intolerant camp very quickly, and that would be more than double what they can normally handle, even on the top end of that. So what it sounds like, what you reduced it probably quite significantly, but you're still quite, you're still above that sort of 15 gram level, which is the top level of most lactose intolerant people. So it might just be that you're in the tolerant camp, but you're on the lower end of it.
Lower end, yeah.
You'd be in, you do experience those symptoms. Whereas I know that personally I'm on the higher end of the tolerant camp.
Yeah.
I am doing a PhD in lactose. You have to experiment and see what your limits are. So I've played around with pure lactose powder, and I've just sort of seen how much I can handle, and I can handle really quite high amounts of it, which is quite nice for me to know.
Absolutely.
But it is something you can experiment with, and milk is a very easy way to do that.
Yeah.
But one thing to note is that there are a number of sort of pathologies and medical conditions and intolerances that are actually related to other things in milk and dairy products other than lactose. So if you tend to get problems with things like whey protein isolate, even with no milk, which has less than a gram, but you still get problems, it might not be that your experience that you have say lactose intolerance. It might be a mild dairy protein allergy, or it might be something else. If you have gastrointestinal problems with milk and then you switch to lactose free milk and there's no difference, what it could be is that there's a condition called beta-1 casein A1 beta casein intolerance, which is where you have an intolerance to one of the casein proteins in milk. And this is still under investigation. We don't know all that much about it. You might have seen adverts for A2 milk around, which is a special kind of milk. It's normal milk, but it comes from cows that don't make this one protein. And this one protein is thought to be linked to some gastrointestinal problems. So this is a problem for some people.
Yeah.
And sometimes people think they have lactose intolerance, but actually, if they remove this specific protein, they're actually fine with the lactose. So if you are really interested in it, and if you're someone who gets problems, I'd say it's worth seeing a GP, and they can refer you on to gastroenterology specialists who can do a number of tests to see whether you're lactose intolerant, whether you're a maldigester, what's going on, basically.
Fantastic. I think it's worth mentioning, I actually use lactose-free milk now as well. It's when I said 200 mils of milk now, it's actually lactose-free milk that I do use. And it's made a huge difference to me. The only actual milk I have now is maybe in a cup of tea. But that's an easy sacrifice to me to make, because I look at how much I feel better for it. And I just think, well, it's easy swap out. So when we then look at lactose, I think we can agree that we started this conversation about how dairy has an effect. We're going to be adding in a Q&A to the podcast in a few weeks' time. And to do that, we're going to need some questions from you guys. So do go over to our team Instagram page at JLX Coaching on Instagram, of course, and click the link in the bio, and it will take you to a quick Google form where you can fill in any of the questions you've got, and we will get to those in the podcast to come. As for coaching, you can also check the link in our Instagram bio for that, or go to the website, which is at the moment jacklenton.com, and you will see the links to coaching there. Have a good day.